to A and E and says, listen, I'm fine, I don't have any problem in my body, in my mental health, I am very good, I'm absolute everything, but I'm coming for you to say, go. When you come to church, we are ill because of our sin. And we are coming to church to ask questions, and the church will give us comfort through Jesus Christ. The church itself cannot, but through, because it's the church of Jesus Christ. Through Christ, we can do everything. أستطيع كل شيء في المسيح الذي يقويني. I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me. Okay? You come into church, you must have questions. You must be thick. And that's why in the old churches, when you enter a church, or you enter a monastery now, even now, when you go to Jerusalem or go to Egypt, when you go to the entrance, it's not, you cannot go like this. Even if you're short, you have to bow down and go through a narrow door. Why? Because there should be a respect. I'm coming, you're saying to God, I'm coming to you and I want help from you. Okay? So, I don't want to take the time. Ihab is a part of the code team. He's coming to talk about the beginning, the creation. Is it creation? Is it, how can we understand it? Is the main question, is scripture against science? Can science and scripture go together or not? Ahab is going to take us through a journey from the beginning, okay, till everything was done perfectly. And he's going to tell us from a scientific point of view, okay, his views and the church view. Ahab, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen.
came and they were playing outside in some neighbour's garden and it landed. What else? Did that, reluctantly came back without the ball, came back really sad. The ball was indeed Danny's. And quite often in our lives, and in the lives of scientists and people in the modern world, they don't want to believe that God exists. And they're suppressing the truth that this ball came from Danny next door. Everything's pointing to that fact. Anything but that God exists. Do you get the analogy? So, we're going to look at how to show that God exists. Danny next door, that's probably his ball. So, what can we learn about nature from God? When you talk to atheists, they say that there is no evidence for God in nature. What's going on? You see, you need to have evidence to be able to discuss with people, but just the fact that you've got evidence doesn't mean that you can convince others. Everyone's got a different interpretation, right? The ball could have come from a plane. The ball could have come from a visiting visitor. It doesn't need to have come from Danny next door. So everyone's got an interpretation of the facts that they see. But what we're going to discuss is clear evidence that some can rule it out, but it would be clear evidence as to God's existence. So let's get to the meat of this. We're going to look at the universe having a beginning, the universe being finely tuned, life itself taking a miracle, and we'll see where we get to. Did the universe have a beginning? Any thoughts? So, I'll allow you this one time to not answer, but every other time you have to talk.
No, we have to stop. We have to have hands up.
Okay.
We don't know, sir, exactly, sir. It's a theory, sir.
Chris,
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much. Just a show of hands then, like Chris boldly did just now. Who believes that the universe had a beginning? Put your hands up. And who believes that the universe just is?
You can't, because there's only
Christians in the auditorium that we...
No, but the thing is, there were only about 7 or 8 raised their hands, and we are more than that. So the rest means that they don't believe.
We're just open. At university, when we gave this lecture at Imperial College, Imperial is an atheist society, atheist college, founded on atheist values. If you wanted to go to a religious university back 200, 300, 400 years ago, you would have chosen Cambridge and Oxford. Where I went to study was absolutely atheist. We gave the lecture in a building called the Huxley Building. Aldous Huxley was a very strong atheist. And this lecture, we put up on the walls of Imperial College, and for the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to this lecture, people were just standing and laughing. The Christian society is going to talk to us about the existence of God from science. We're going to really, show them what, we're going to make mincemeat of them. This lecture was attended by several hundred people, and they tended to sit in groups, as you do. On the left side were the cosmologists, physicists, mathematicians, chemists, biologists, social scientists, the Islamic Society right at the front on the right-hand side, and I can't remember the rest. But it was that kind of feeling, and at the beginning it was raw, scary. But I'll mention that in a minute. In the early 20th century, evidence began to start collecting that the universe had a beginning. You see, prior to the 20th century, let me show you. Prior to the 20th century, this is what people believed. If Father wasn't here and we weren't in the church, I would comment about this guy's name. But Immanuel Kant, in the 18th century, proposed the theory that the universe is an infinite expanse with no beginning, no end, therefore no creator. Immanuel Kant was a philosopher who, when he looked, he said the universe has no beginning, has no end, therefore it has no creator. That was the largest view of the time. His ideas began to spread, and it had already been spreading with the Enlightenment scientists, to the point that it was used as an excuse. If the universe is always here, if there was no beginning, no end, then we don't need a creator. Paul Davies, in a modern book called The Goldilocks Enigma, because the book was just about how just right the universe was, we'll mention that later, wrote this: many scientists are struggling to construct a fully comprehensible theory of the physical universe. Openly, those scientists admit that their motivation for doing it is to finally get rid of God, whom they view as a dangerous and infantile delusion. So, in his view, many scientists who are struggling to find the theory of everything are doing it so that we wouldn't need to have God in the picture. He, by the way, is an atheist. Sometimes he calls himself an agnostic, but he other times calls himself an atheist. In 1929, Edwin Hubble began to observe the universe from his laboratory in the States, from his telescopic height, and he began to see that stars were moving away from every other star at 100 million miles an hour. Wherever he looked, in whichever direction he studied, he found that every star was moving away from every other star at these astronomical speeds. And he began to notice, not only was it immense, but maybe there's something there. Why is everything moving away from everything else? So, then came along, actually before Edwin did these studies, this German priest. Anyone know who he is? We know the German guy on the right.
Monsignor George.
Oh, there's always one. I'm going to get rid of that. I keep forgetting to get rid of that title at that point. Monsignor Georges Lemaitre was a mathematician and a cosmologist. He, right from the early 19th century, he took Albert Einstein's theories of relativity and what Einstein had called the cosmological constant, and he rolled it back, and he was able to show that the universe has not always been present, that the universe had a beginning. And to him as a priest, that tied up with what the Bible said. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and God said, let there be light. And to him, that was the moment of creation. So he was really interested in that, and he was able to show from Einstein's calculations that the universe had a beginning. And it wasn't until later that it was backed up by the discoveries of Edwin Hubble. We'll get to that. So he published this theory, and he took Einstein's theory, rolled it back, showed through Hubble's investigation that the universe did indeed have a beginning from a singular point. So we're going to look at that as we speak. Georges Lemaitre called this beginning the primordial atom, or the egg, and imagine the beginning with unbelievable power that created the universe from nothing. If you pick up a book today, Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking's book, The Brief History of Time, that was written in the 1990s, Stephen Hawking at that time was studying the idea that the universe did not have a beginning, that it sort of got close to a beginning and then would expand again and then contract and expand. Hawking did not like the idea that the universe had a beginning. It wasn't until some of these discoveries started to come out and experiments made that scientists began to broadly admit, seems that the universe had a beginning after all. So the Big Bang Theory started with this German priest naming it Georges Lemaitre. What I'm very keen on doing here is a lot of the next bit of this talk is going to be talking about the universe having a beginning. Of course it will talk about the Big Bang Theory. I'm not saying that this is a biblical Christian theory called the Big Bang Theory in the Bible. I'm just saying that science is getting close to what we knew in the Bible, that the universe did have a beginning. that the universe did come from nothing. That when God uses the Hebrew word, in the beginning God created. Abuna, what's the word created in Hebrew there? Bereshit, what does it mean? Bereshit.
Bereshit means they spread.
Yes.
Spread.
And it means, different to other making, you can make, the word make is to use material.
Bara. Bara means create.
Create from nothing. From nothing. So the Bible right from the beginning said the universe was created from nothing, not from material that was just hanging around. Now science is getting close to that understanding. How close? Let's see. So at the time that Georges Lemaitre was presenting his theory, Albert Einstein also did not agree with the idea that the universe had a beginning. He liked the idea that the universe was stable. And I'll show you a video that combines the two ideas and explains what happened. But remember Immanuel Kant in the 18th century saying that if the universe had no beginning, no end, it didn't have a creator? Well, now, in the 19th century, 20th century, and now with us in the 21st century, we're beginning to see that the universe indeed did have a beginning, does have an end, does have a creator. So have a look at this video, and then we'll ask questions.
The man who gave us the scientific concept of the Big Bang worked here, of all places, in this Belgian cathedral. Father Georges Lemaitre, born in 1894, may be the most important physicist you've likely never heard of.
Lemaitre was responsible for the idea that the universe not only was expanding, but that the universe has expanded from a dense state. He called it primeval atom. Now we call it Big Bang, but it was his idea.
The seed for the idea came from Albert Einstein and his theory of general relativity in the early 20th century. But Einstein himself did not like it. Einstein felt more comfortable in a static, unchanging universe. But Lemaitre took Einstein's chaotic, finite universe to its fiery origin.
If Einstein had the courage of his convictions in some sense, he would have recognized that the static universe he believed in was not compatible with the theory that he'd come up with.
In general relativity, Einstein proposed that mass warps space and time to create gravity. But if gravity is always pulling in, then what keeps everything from ultimately drawing together into one massive object? Einstein believed there must be another equal counterforce pushing out in opposition to gravity, keeping the eternal universe in perfect balance.
So what Einstein did was he tweaked his own equations with what is called a cosmological constant.
But Einstein was wrong. There was no yin to gravity's yang. Lemaitre correctly believed that there was no cosmological constant. Instead, he found evidence of an expanding universe in Einstein's theories as he studied them in the mid-1920s.
Georges Lemaitre took the original equations and saw that they contained solutions which represented an expanding universe. And of course, not too long after that, Edwin Hubble comes along, and by his observation showed the universe actually is expanding.
But what was behind this expansion that overcame the push of gravity? Lemaitre proposed something absolutely radical. If the universe is expanding, then in the past it was smaller. Ultimately, in the distant past, it was infinitely small. A primeval atom, or cosmic egg.
Perhaps there was this cosmic explosion that set the universe into motion. So he would go to various conferences and tap people on the shoulder, and people would smile at him and, basically humor the man.
But few people took Father Lemaitre's cosmic egg very seriously.
Nobody really paid attention to Lemaitre for a very long time because he considered saying, this is just sort of somewhat wild stuff.
I think there was some resistance to having somebody in the scientific camp and in the religious camp, but Did that make it difficult for some scientists to perhaps embrace him as much as they would someone who was not in that position? Probably.
As Hubble's observations were refined throughout the mid-20th century, it became clear that our expanding universe fit nicely into Lemaitre's theory of a cosmic egg, one that expanded with so much force that it overcomes the pull of gravity and keeps the universe expanding to this very day. Father Lemaitre truly is one of many fathers of the Big Bang theory.
Any questions so far? Any questions up until this point? Chris?
So, if this is true, are you saying that God didn't exist before the Big Bang?
That's a brilliant question. So, what I'm saying is that because the Big Bang is the beginning of energy, matter, space, time, so you can't have space without somewhere. There was nowhere. And you can't have matter without it being somewhere, otherwise it can't exist. And you can't have matter without it being somewhere and at some time. And matter is linked to energy, E equal mc squared, so you didn't have energy. So I'm saying, because before the Big Bang there was no energy, no matter, no time, no space, then the person that started it all off had to have been outside of time, immaterial, full of energy, full of power. And what was the last one? And outside of space, doesn't need to be limited to a space and time. So that would be my answer to you, Chris.
Did he exist then?
Yes, he did.
What was he doing?
This is a brilliant question, and it leads on to the talks that we have around the Holy Trinity, which isn't today, but if God was by himself, then you can imagine he was pretty selfish. But in our church, there's a very strong teaching that we have, biblical teaching, that God was he was dancing, Chris. He was in a love dance with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, being in full communion of love before creation.
Because if we said God is love, he loved who? He loved himself? That's selfishness. But that's why we believe Christianity is the only answer for when we say God is love, God is here. Because if we say God here, he here who? Before this. He loved who? It must be through the triune God.
Yeah.
So the only solution for all the question you have before creation is the triune God. Okay? And I have a question.
Okay. Chris, is that all right for now? And then please come in after. But there was a question over here. Chris.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, he said himself doesn't have to be Christian theory, so just to say this is a Christian God that's created the universe. Could be,
What's your name? Alex, your question, as well as Chris's, is absolutely brilliant. Just because we show that the universe had a beginning and they couldn't have come together by chance, which we'll come to, doesn't mean that it was a Christian God that created it. Some of the talks that we do afterwards in the Apologetics course look at evidence for the Bible and look at the Bible itself is what it says true and what Jesus did and evidence of the resurrection. So we build up an idea that Christianity is quite unique in that it can defend itself and it stands up to scrutiny and it holds truth. That means we need to look at it and take note. So your question is perfect. Any others? At this point, we'll move on.
Can I ask my question? You're skipping.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Carl.
Is that with intention?
No.
All right. So you're saying to me that the primordial atom or the cosmological egg, okay, was there and it contained everything into it. And at the same time, you're saying to me that this egg does not have a space and does not have, it did not have space, it did not have time, it did not have energy. At the same time, you're saying to me that every energy came from it.
Yeah. So, Georges Lemaitre said that it started from a singular point that was infinitesimally small, and that he, as a Christian, believes that actually before that point there was nothing. Nothing. And even in the books by
Nothing in terms of material, but it's
No.
nothing in terms of God, but nothing of material.
nothing of material.
Nothing of-
Absolutely. Thank you for your correction. So even in the book Stephen Hawking, Brief History of Time, he writes, we can't really try to understand anything beyond the point of the universe starting, the Big Bang. And he writes in his book, he says, because at that point, space, time, matter, energy came into being. Before then, the laws of physics don't hold. And so I can't comment, Stephen Hawking says. Get the Brief History of Time book, have a look at it. Go for it.
So you've been talking about like, how everything was beginning and so it's expanding. I'm assuming the expansion is slowing down. What happens?
No, unfortunately, expansion is speeding up.
So how does it really end if it's still?
That's a brilliant question. Because one of the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, law 2 of physics says that everything ends up leading to chaos, then more and more over time, there's going to be a more chaotic universe. The temperature will start to dissipate. Eventually things will explode. Even our sun is going to explode. And it will be so far expanded that we won't have any living thing at all. So it will lead to entropy. Okay, let's move on, because this is still part 1. So, Edwin Hubble, in looking at stars, he was able to say, well, if the universe had a beginning, then we could imagine that we will still have the background temperature of the Big Bang. All throughout the universe, we'd be able to measure that background temperature. Now, I'll tell you what that means in a slightly false way. If you've got a big enough telescope, and if light travels at 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, which it does, then can I get a big enough telescope to look at the beginning of light when the universe was created? In theory, you can. In practice, it's very hard to build a really big telescope that can look at light at the beginning of the universe and see creation happening. But that's exactly what scientists began to develop. In 1984, 82, they launched a Hubble telescope that they began to look at evidence if what we should expect if the universe had a beginning, cosmic background radiation, a temperature of about 3 or 4 Kelvin. Remember, Kelvin is minus 273 degrees, absolute zero. If the universe did have a beginning from a big explosion, then the leftover temperature should still be there. Then wherever we look in the universe, there should be almost random, chaotic light. And if we look farther back, we should see almost the light at the beginning of the universe. So that's what they had in mind, that they were going to use the telescope to discover. 1981, Stephen Hawking was in a Jesuit conference with Pope John Paul II, and he was talking about creation, Big Bang, things like that. Stephen Hawking didn't believe it, and so he says this. At the end of the conference, the participants were granted an audience with the Pope. He told us that it was all right to study the evolution of the universe after the Big Bang, but we should not inquire into the Big Bang itself, because that was the moment of creation and therefore the work of God. So I was glad at that point, writes Stephen Hawking, that the Pope didn't know what I'd just been speaking about. That the universe basically had no beginning, no end, and it was always there. So that was Stephen Hawking's view in 1981. And he writes in his book, 1988, Brief History of Time, the idea that space and time may form a closed surface, i.e. had a beginning without boundary, also has profound implications for the role of God. He writes, it would still be up to God to wind up the clockwork, i.e. get it started, and choose how to start it off. So long as the universe had a beginning, we could suppose it had a creator. Stephen Hawking, an atheist, writes this because Stephen Hawking, at the time, did not believe that the universe had a beginning. Even after Lemaitre, even after Einstein's cosmological constant, and Edwin Hubble's investigations. So, what happened? He also writes this, chapter 3. We should therefore, okay, so as far as we're concerned, events before the Big Bang can have no consequence, so they should not form part of the scientific model. What I was just saying earlier. We should therefore cut them out of the model and say that time had a beginning at the Big Bang. Many people don't like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, seized upon this idea of the Big Bang model, and in 1951 officially pronounced it to be in accordance with the Bible. There were therefore a number of attempts to avoid a conclusion that there has been a Big Bang. And he was one of those people that was trying to avoid the idea that the universe had a beginning. Do you get me there? So, 1992, they launched Cosmic something background explorer. Can't remember what the O stands for. It's there somewhere. Just the O of Cosmic. Was a satellite, and it was launched in 1992 to look at the evidence for the Big Bang. We said that it should see background radiation that was quite sporadic and random. They should see background temperature of about 3 degrees Kelvin and various other assumptions. Did they find it? And it precisely was able to measure quite a lot of these things. But what were the results? Well, that's a very rough picture of one of the pictures it came back with. The cosmic background radiation is the remnant of the Big Bang itself. I'm not going to go into that because I talked about it. But they began to get evidence coming back that the universe at the beginning was quite random. Now you get spots of very big explosions that are happening, which is star formation already about to start. And it isn't exactly at the beginning, it's several 100 million years after the Big Bang. Our universe is about 13.8 billion years old. The universe began 13.8 billion years ago, but when you look to 100 million years ago, after the Big Bang, so 13.7 billion years back, you get to see that it's still very babyish. There are no stars, no galaxies, but things are beginning to happen. And the background radiation of 2.75 degrees Kelvin is noticed across the whole universe, wherever it looks. When word of the 1998, because it took 6 years for the results to start coming through, of the Berkeley discovery, because it was the Berkeley project of the Cosmic Background Explorer, that showed evidence for the universe expanding, first reached Stephen Hawking. He said, "It's too early, too preliminary for me to change my mind." Later, he did change his mind. He says, "I've now had more time to consider the observations, and they look quite good," he told Astronomy magazine in October 1999. "This led me to reconsider my theoretical prejudices." Even Stephen Hawking begins to change his mind. How much so? Let's look at this. After the full results come back, Michael Turner of University of Chicago says, "Unbelievably important, they found the holy grail of cosmology." Stephen Hawking now says, "It is the discovery of the century, if not of all time." George Smoot of Berkeley says, "What we have found is evidence for the birth of the universe. It's like looking at God." Quite remarkable quotes. I'm not going to go into what powered the Big Bang, but I want you to watch this video and then we'll have some more questions.
Since the late 1920s, everything we know about how our universe works has been turned upside down.
It's important to realize how much our picture of the universe has changed over the last century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the conventional wisdom in science was that the universe was static and eternal.
In 1929, that all changed. At the Mount Wilson Observatory above Los Angeles, astronomer Edwin Hubble discovered galaxies aren't stuck in one place. Not only are they moving, but they're flying away from Earth at incredible speeds. This was the first real evidence of the Big Bang.
All galaxies stranger still, those that were twice as far away were moving twice as fast. And those that were 3 times as far away were moving 3 times as fast, and so on. Everything was moving away from us.
It became known as Hubble's Law. His discovery is still the starting point for exploration of the Big Bang.
What Hubble convincingly demonstrated by seeing the motion of those galaxies is that the universe is expanding.
Theoretically, an expanding universe must have started from a single point. By measuring how fast the universe is expanding, astronomers calculated backwards and figured out when it burst into life.
People ask the question, how do you know that the universe is 13.7 billion years old? I mean, smarty pants, you weren't there 13.7 billion years ago. Well, when you watch television on videotape, you hit the stop button when you see an explosion, and you can run it backwards and see when it actually took place. The same thing takes place with cosmology. We can run the videotape backwards and then calculate when it all came from a cosmic explosion.
Any questions? We've only got 5 minutes in this part left, but any questions so far? On top of the questions that we had from Chris and from Alex and from Father Michael. Yes, over here. Why that timing? I think the questions why is exactly what Chris was speaking about before this. We've always been the question why. We can only speculate, but what we do know is that the Christian idea that Lord Jesus taught us that he was Trinitarian, that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are 3 persons in one divinity, living in a communion of love, in a dance of love. You could ask, are you married? When you do get married, one of the most annoying questions your aunties and uncles will ask you, so when are you having kids? It's like, you just pressured us for ages to get married, and now you can't stop telling us when we're having kids. Just get out of our business. We could ask God, why did you start the universe then? But we won't know the answer. Not as far as I know. Because I don't know the time. There was no time before then. And he's outside time himself. So
There was time before that.
no, time is a...
No. You've got the year dot.
Yep.
The year dot, that's 0, that's start. Then you go
Back in our thinking as humans,
Yes.
we
Materialist.
there must have been time.
Exactly.
But that isn't how the universe works. And even Stephen Hawking would say,
I don't think he's American, Stephen.
yeah, sorry.
You know, Chris, ask a question. If you found a dot on a paper, you say, from where this dot is, will you know? But you find a dot there, that's the dot, that's what you know, it's the beginning, okay?
Yeah.
But who put that dot before,
Yeah.
it is not, you were not there, so you can't know, you will not find it.
Now, as well as that, Father, the question Chris asked, and the question that's been asked by a few of us, is fundamental to the fact that we're created beings. We're beings that exist in time. We're beings that know that everything must have a beginning and everything has an end. It's the reality of who we are. To try and think of something outside of this limitation of our physical nature is very hard. It's something I can't answer you.
I used to, as a kid, had I stopped.
Yeah.
And you know, Christ.
Sorry, one more question, and then we'll end this bit.
Just following on Tom's question, when you said that it's expanding and then ultimately it's going to end. And so
I don't know when the end will happen.
No,
I
I'm
know
not asking
yeah.
when. But my question is, I thought that initially God created Adam and Eve for eternity, and it's only when sin happened that that entered the world. So how did? But then with the universe expanding, it must have been expanding
What's your name?
Irene.
Irene, your question is brilliant. You see, our eternity hasn't changed God's plan. God's plan is still for us to be eternal beings. We've got His image, His likeness, His imprint. But the fact is that if God created the universe, God is outside the universe, so that even in Hebrew, the idea of the firmament that you saw, the firmament was describing the atmosphere when we see clouds and rain. Above the firmament, it was called the heavens. And above the heavens, it was called the heaven of heavens. And St. Paul mentions it, that I've seen the third heaven in the quote. So it means that he went and had a vision of the throne room of God. The throne room of God is outside the heaven of heavens. It's outside the cosmological universe. God exists in a place outside of all of that. And that's where we exist.
So this is where Adam and Eve were?
No. Adam and Eve were placed, according to us, according to the Bible, on earth. But Adam and Eve had an eternal destiny. It says in the book by St. Athanasius on the Incarnation that if they continued in a state of sinlessness, they would be transitioned to live with God in eternity in heaven. If they continued in that state, then it would be easy for them to be transitioned. They weren't going to live forever on paradise.
So God had, sorry to go back to this question, so God had in mind when He created the universe, He had in mind that it's going to come to an end?
Yes, He had eternity in mind. And there we get quite a lot of ideas as to what's the point then of the physical universe and things like that. It's a good question, really. And that's Thomas's question. Remind me your name again. Mark. Mark, thank you.
Mark, you can just say any Mark. There is 4 or 5 Marks already.
Not
so
Mina.
just Mark, not Mina. It's opposite to Brighton.
Okay, go for it.
So we're trying basically to prove the existence of a creator by reaching this point where we had nothing and then we had a beginning.
In this first part, it's saying, so, yes.
And then we had this explosion. But in essence, explosion is random.
Is it?
So can you say that everything that happened after the explosion was actually planned by the creator?
So I want you to remember that question, Mark, and ask it after the second part that we're going to do. So if the universe had a beginning with an explosion is random, what's that got to do with God? And I said, wait until the next bit. And then we got a question from Alex, a question from Bishoy. Alex.
How do you reconcile the Big Bang?
Sorry?
How do you reconcile the Big Bang and Genesis?
With Genesis.
Genesis is saying, God created the heavens and the earth in 7 days. I feel like most Christians believe that's a metaphor and just used to explain.
Again, Alex, you are brilliant. One of the books, has anyone read Questions with the People by Pope Shenouda III? It's like 4 volumes. Really small book, but short, sharp questions. Volume 1, question 1. Are there 7 days of creation? Pope Shenouda III, the late patriarch before the one that we have now, says, there are eons of time. Even the word yom means period of time. And so it reconciles because the Hebrew is, in the beginning God created. The word for create there is from nothing. In the beginning God created the universe from nothing and made the heavens and the earth. And the word for heavens there is not the firmament that we have sky and rain, or it means the heavens of heavens, the cosmological event, the galaxy, the universe that we exist in. In the beginning, God created from nothing the universe. And the universe had no form, no void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the earth. It's very in line with the book of Genesis. Now, what I'm not saying is that the Big Bang Theory is another way of saying the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that science has come up with something that's quite close to what we have always been reading in the book of Genesis.
It's plausible to what we have from the knowledge of the cosmological studies that we have. But it is not, we are not saying that it is, because in 100 years' time, there may be another theory, which is completely different. But what we say for scientists, this is what you believe, and what you believe is showing you and directing you towards a beginning. In terms, therefore, if there is a beginning, there must be someone who started that bottom to begin. Who started it? It's random? We can't.
And that's that slide here that we'll talk through in a sec. Bishoy, what was your question?
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so we said, I can't remember which question you answered. You said God is love and love creates, right? Similar to the marriage analogy. But does that, so when we're talking about cosmological and all that sort of stuff, and people with less moral ratings out there and stuff like that, does the fact that God is love mean that God doesn't also create love?
Brilliant. And that question coming up in part 3. So let's discuss that.
One last thing.
Okay, close to the end.
Yeah. One thing, guys. Remember, we said we can't ask all the questions. But even the scientists, even when you read here, Stephen Hawking, he says, before the Big Bang, because it's beyond anything.
Beyond science.
Beyond science. Without knowledge, without anything, we can't. And that's why in John chapter 1, verse 26, is in verse...
Chapter 1, verse 26.
Yeah. Verse 18, it says, no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. So we have a declaration. That's when we talk about the Trinity, we talk about the revelation, the declaration of God.
I need to use those quotes and put it into my next time I give this. Please remember, Father, we need to change this together. Atheists' main quarrel with the Big Bang is this. It leads to this argument. Everything that begins must have a beginning. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. If the universe began to exist, then it must have had a cause. Right? That's the atheist's main quarrel with the idea that the universe had a beginning. And that's what we just said, that's currently the best theory at the moment. Does the Bible support? Please just give me 2 minutes and then we'll end here. We'll have a 10-minute break and then we'll come back for part 2. Does the Bible support the idea of an expanding universe? I believe it has and does. Isaiah 40, 22 and other verses talk about it is he who sits above the circle of the earth. Circle is an English translation of a Hebrew word chug. Chug means sphere, but we translate it circle. He who sits above the sphere of the earth and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. God is constantly stretching out the heavens like a curtain, an expanding universe. It's a bit of a stretch in my imagination to take that verse, but I think the Bible is actually quite close to an expanding universe, to a spherical earth, even when we only discovered or agreed to that discovery 400, 500, 600 years ago. And many other verses about him stretching. I'll end with this one slide. The one who created the universe must himself be uncaused. So quite often the question that you get in your head, me and Chris, would be, if everything had to have a beginning, why can't God have a beginning? Again, let's take into consideration that that's our limited humanity. The one that caused everything has to be uncaused, even in theory, even in science. Yeah? The uncaused cause must be uncaused. He must be beyond space and time. He must be outside of matter. He must be powerful beyond measure to create all energy. That is the God that I believe I worship, that we worship. And we'll stop there. We'll have is it okay for a 10-minute break?
He's running now. He's fighting. First,
you're sanguine. Give the rest of it. Still on. You're still on.